3 people, and you're going to have 4 weeks, do something.
It started out of pure stubbornness, which is great.
Without necessarily meaning to, I think we found this quite interesting niche.
No, we did some stuff, and the fact that it's invisible means it worked.
I think art is encoded knowledge and experience.
At that time, we were really fascinated by the whole transmedia concept.
That was it, not the time-travelling robot idea that we had.
Hello, I am Sam Fry, and this is Technique, the podcast where we speak to artists about technology. Following the last couple of episodes where we spoke to a variety of artists, today we are back to just one, although it is a good one. Today's interview has been working as a media artist, curator and theorist for over 2 decades. The artist is Patrick Lichty. Patrick is currently an assistant professor at Zayed University in the United Arab Emirates. As an artist, he has been a member of a number of activist groups, including the Yes Men and Artmark, who he joined back in 1997. Throughout this time, his work has often responded to the trends of technology and wider society, which he has responded to using a range of media, from paint to glass, video, internet art, and artificial intelligence. I will let Patrick introduce himself shortly, but before I do, I should warn you that the audio for this episode is not the best and includes quite a lot of background noise on Patrick's side. Saying that, the conversation is really interesting, so I was keen to still publish the episode, but I understand that some people will find the audio a little hard to listen to. So please have a listen and see how you get along. In my view, it's really worth a listen. In which case, I'm going to start by handing over to Patrick, where he begins by introducing himself.
My name's Patrick Lichty. I'm, I guess, what you would call an intermedia-based new media artist. I've been doing this for about 30 years. Conceptually, what I do is I deal with the idea of mediation. What happens when you throw things through the dark lens of technology? I've been involved in a lot of activist groups like the Yes Men and Artmark and another group called Haymarket Riot. Also, I've been part of a performance art group in Second Life for about 15 years called Second Front that has done about 50 different performances, and on my own, I'm usually what you would call an emerging genres media artist. And what does that mean? I'm usually, looking at what's happening in art and technology and using, new forms. Right now I'm doing a lot of work in artificial intelligence. But I was trained as a painter and glass artist, but I also went to school for electrical engineering as well. And I started doing watercolors in the late 1980s and went through print to video to internet art, and have just kept exploring this boundary between traditional and technological art. A lot of what I've done is video art, and a lot of it using basically plotters and what I call machine processes to process paintings and redo them as machine-drawn, really intricate machine-drawn pieces. And then lately, what I've been doing is that I did 512 calligraphy pieces on my iPad, and I fed it into a artificial intelligence system, and through 2 or 3 distillations, I'm trying to literally find out the patterns that are going on inside my own head. Literally almost trying to use my consciousness as a medium in a visual sense. But anyway, in short, I'm a new media artist of about 30 years who's been through a lot of different changes, a lot of different media.
You're in Abu Dhabi now. Where did you grow up? Because I don't sense an Abu Dhabi background.
No. I'm pretty clearly an American. I grew up actually in Akron, Ohio, and then North Canton, Ohio. First, the home of the punk band Devo. And it's kind of funny that in my post-bac days when I did some glass work, I went to Kent State where the student shootings had been 20 years previous. And the town that I grew up most of my life was North Canton, Ohio, where Hoovers were made. So that kind of gives you a strange context on things. And then my father got me an Atari 800 computer in 1979. And, they said, oh, you need to go to computer engineering school, which I did. But the one thing that my parents didn't see is that I was drawing and doing music on it. So about a couple years afterwards and a few years in the engineering field, I quit and started my own art and design studio, which I'd been studying on my own during the 80s, and there really weren't any schools to learn that, Yeah, I started exhibiting and doing corporate design work, basically from a self-taught perspective.
That design school, so what were you doing there? What were you setting up?
Well, my mother was an artist, and she basically taught me. And I was raised on science fiction, and at first I wanted to be an industrial designer who would eventually be a special effects artist in the movies. And when I found out that the program nearby me shut down, I basically wound up getting involved in fine art. And then in the end, what I was doing is I was doing a lot of graphic design, and I was already showing my artwork. And it was very interesting is that in the early 90s that there were a lot of online communities of contemporary artists who were working in this thing at the time, that was going to become new media, and I became involved with them and really kind of became, from Canton, Ohio, a virtual New York artist. And I was working in digital print and video and, what I call now emerging genres. I never really went to school for it. And the thing is that most of the people from my generation didn't either. And after a lot of exhibiting in a lot of international venues, I realized that I wanted to become an academic. I had realized that I needed an academic background, so I did go through graduate school in a computer art degree in America, and actually got in on strength of portfolio. Did 3 years as a MFA student and came out, and I became an art professor. So that almost feeds into one of your other questions that you're talking to me about, like what's one of the biggest challenges that I've had as an artist. I'd kind of say that really in the 1990s, it was much easier to support yourself in your studio because of the fact that hourly rates for graphic and interactive design were much, much higher than after 2000 and when they started getting outsourced to other countries. So I was working about half-time as an interactive designer and then exhibiting a lot. But the thing is that I realized that in the early 2000s that situation became increasingly precarious. So I realized that I needed to become an academic or to get really serious about having a professional studio. And at that time, I wasn't sure that was going to be entirely possible. So I really just thought that being an academic was much more feasible. And because of my track record, I went immediately into a tenure track position and kind of went forward from there. And that has really been kind of my solution to the stability thing. I think also another challenge in being in technology and arts is really kind of surfing along with a culture that is constantly in flux. And the thing is that two things had happened. On one hand, there really wasn't any funding, not much support, and we were getting by as we could on non-institutional support in the 1990s. And then with some of the biennials picking up new media in around 2000, academic programs started springing up and you had a lot more people coming in. And actually one thing that happened is that contemporary art really is much more about kind of the ecosystem of objects, and new media isn't so much about that. It's more about experiences. And so technologically based art shifted much more towards contemporary, I think, in the mid-2000s, and I think that was a big challenge to deal with, and I think that's why I started going much more into like machine drawings and video art and 3D sculptures and matters like that. I think, and as Kandinsky said, art is a product of its time, and I think that's reflected by any artist's practice, really.
Can you tell a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing? And I'd love to find out more about this idea of using AI to understand your own thought processes.
So, for about the last 3 or 4 years, I've been doing a lot of things in augmented reality, virtual reality, and AI. We don't quite have the time to, kind of go through all of that, but I'll kind of say that there's a couple projects that I'm doing right now. I'll say, first of all, in Abu Dhabi, our lockdown has been significant. I mean, this is the COVID era, right? And there was this one point where I was kind of limited to about 2-3 kilometers from where I was at, and it almost makes you a little bit mad sometimes, And so I was walking around. But there was a very interesting thing is that with my tools or sometimes just the technologies that are around me, and there was this app for my cell phone called Displayland that allowed you to do 3D scans of the environments you were in. And this is what I wound up doing. I wound up doing 3D scans of making 3D models of, the places I was at, the construction sites, the courtyard to the pool next to my apartment, or the park nearby, the library. And so what happens is that they were giving me these really strange videos, and I've been working with a Italian curator here, Giuseppe Moscatello, who's been wanting me to turn this into a more formal project. He says, can we make this more interactive, and can we deliver it on the web? And I basically wound up discovering ways to render the 3D models that Displayland was making and go through them using basically VR-based real estate software, And sounds really corny, but the thing is that in doing this, going all over the UAE, as the restrictions let up, I was able to go to the Louvre and scan it, and I guess I do live near the Abu Dhabi Louvre. And so the thing is that I just kind of found these fractured landscapes that I've been part of. So the interactive experience is going to be at something called Nation 2.0 in a couple weeks. But stills from this have been in a couple shows like At a Distance 4.0 and New Digital Collage. The other thing that I've been doing is that for about 2 years now, literally, I've been working with my iPad, and Japanese is my second language. And so I've been working with doing Japanese calligraphy, but in an asemic way. In other words, a way that it isn't really saying anything. A friend of mine named Jim Leftwich came up with this idea of asemic language. In other words, like non-semantic language. And so I've been doing these asemic calligraphies in the Japanese style for about 2 years. I finished 512 of them. And then the one thing that these things called generative adversarial networks, which was used for that one piece by the Obvious Group, called the Portrait of Edmund Bellamy. They threw like 15,000 portraits over like 500 years and saw what they came out. They do with patterns. So I said, okay, I'm going to take these 512, I'm going to take 256 of these and put 256 in and see what the patterns are from one, and take 256 of those, set them aside, and do that with another 256, take the patterns, set those aside. Then I'm going to run those adversarially against each other, and hopefully seeing that the patterns cancel out, and just see, really what, from a neurological perspective, kind of like what my habitual patterns are, and then that reveals from a cognitive perspective what my creative sensibilities are. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm literally trying to decode my own creative sensibilities by taking AI, feeding it through, looking at the patterns, and then cross-checking 2 sets of patterns to see what's left, and seeing whether there are literal patterns in the gestures of my mark making. I call it personal taxonomies that basically represent a deep structure of what my head does when I create. I mean, literally using almost saying like, what's the fingerprint of my consciousness, when I create this work. And one of two things. I think this is either pointing towards bridge between neuroscience and cognitive science, or I am chasing my tail in the most absolutely spectacular way that you could ever imagine, and I hope that's just entertaining.
You've taken the style of Japanese writing. Have you seen any results?
I've been sharing some of those on my Instagram at Patlichty, Patlichty. And on my Facebook, I just shared one of the animations that I've been doing from one of the trials. And basically what I work with is that I've been working with a couple of groups. One is a guy named Ahmed Al-Gamal and his company Playform, which is basically my AI platform that I've been working with to generate these, because of the fact that I tried working, with code with things like PyTorch and all these sorts of things. But I mean, really what happens, there are just times in which when you're just sitting down and just banging out a whole bunch of code and just trying to work out things down in a computer science perspective, which is doable, but the thing is that, sometimes you get so in the weeds, with the computer science that it starts canceling out your creative process. So the thing is Ahmed and his group have been really good with helping me with sorting this out. And this has been sort of feeding into another group that myself and my partner, Keen, at the Sabian have been working with, called Tech Expressionism. Is basically, we're a group that are looking at the idea of the extension of the expressionist tradition, through the use of technology. And that can be anything from pointing towards technology, or in this case, looking at, the affective relation of the artist with technology, like I'm doing. And so these have been two groups that have been really great to work with, and I'm really kind of in the process of launching this body of work over this year.
What's funny is, in a lot of worlds, people are quite fearful of AI because they see it as an opportunity to automate something that might be someone's current job. I guess you're purposefully trying to automate yourself, trying to go, well, all right, maybe I don't need to do these anymore. Maybe I'll let the computer do it.
Yeah, here's the thing, is that if you think about it, here's a good story, is that when I was in an exhibition, I'd won some prize, and we sat down for some coffee and said, tell me what program you use. And I said, all right, I'll tell you what program you use if you tell me which paintbrush and oils you use. And I'm just saying that on one hand, we can say that anything beyond finger painting is an abstraction of human gesture. In other words, a paint and oils is a technology. And so what happens is that, how do we as human beings use an apparatus to express our own creative vision? And the thing is that, sure, there are people out there that do a lot of button mashing. Honestly, it's like, okay, sure, you can go out and use a neural net, or you can use a Photoshop filter and that sort of thing. And I mean, how creative or not, I think really in this day and age, it's really about having your work match up with your intention. I mean, if you're really trying to make a piece of work, beyond that, I really don't judge people beyond that. I mean, I know what I'm trying to do with my work, and what other people are trying to do with their work is fine. But really what's happening here is that I have questions about my humanity, about my existence, about what it means to be an artist. I'm a technological native, so I use these tools to sort of test my own questions, against myself through these experiments. And I know that I have an interesting dialogue in going through these on my own, but I hope that other people see what I'm revealing through these processes and that I share with others. I think there's a lot to be said about asking questions of technology. Kind of like McLuhan, I'm a native of it, but I don't always. I think some things about technology are fantastic. I think some things about technology I utterly question. I'm quite agnostic. But what happens is that I think the thing that is important is the interest in asking these questions as an artist.
Definitely. It comes back to that point you made earlier, the quote of, art reflecting the time you're in. And actually, people are asking questions about technology, and in general. I think a lot of people, I work for a technology company. I ask questions about the technology that we're building, I guess the ethics of things that we're building. I think there's always questions like that. But also, I think more and more people looking at, well, how can I train my mind to do this better, and how can I improve this about my ways of thinking? Your experiments, you're conducting your own investigations, the questions that you're trying to answer, do relate to that world we're in.
The one thing that I think is very interesting is the idea of, what they call solutionism. In other words, the idea that everything somehow can be reduced to these problems that we can somehow try to find solutions for, and somehow either find solutions to our humanity or efficiencies or whatnot. And the thing is that sometimes I don't think that there's necessarily a solution to humanity. I think that there are things that are ineffable qualities about the human experience that can't necessarily be reduced to a design solution. The questions that are posed by things like philosophy and ethics and aesthetics, and we're messy, squishy beings, and we're not machine. I actually did this one piece that was when I interacted with a bunch of rovers with sumi brushes and that sort of thing, little 3-wheeled rovers that went across a 21 by 7 foot landscape piece. I called it man-machine interface. And the thing is, I was putting barriers that I'd put up in front of these things, and I'd move them around and I'd watch how these things were going. And this to me was a great metaphor for what the human condition in the technological age. In other words, where does the line between the human and the technology, and I'm not necessarily saying machine, is. It's what happens between our knowledge as human beings and our application of that knowledge, if we're to take a strict reading of technology as being the application of applied knowledge. And how does that relate to us as creative individuals, really? And how can we learn more about culture by doing these creative explorations through the use of applied knowledge as a creative tool? Maybe I'm getting a little philosophical.
What's next for you?
Well, one challenge is readapting to becoming an American again. My family's moving back to America next year, and so we're settling in, and I'm settling into a mass communication program at Winona State, but still working with Zayed University back and forth. I'm not exactly sure how much my home country has changed. I hear it's changed a lot in the last 5 years. So we'll see. We'll see how much culture shock I've had versus the culture shock of moving to Arabia. That might be fun. And then the thing is that then I'm really thinking about, in my working with these technologies, AR, VR, AR, and that sort of thing, is that I'm really thinking about maybe looking at mixing a study of history, because I've been very interested in the telecommunications arts of the late 70s and the early 80s and that sort of thing. I actually have all the equipment as well. So, basically, I think what I'm really interested in, what the next steps are, is to be, once again, asking those questions about maybe where have we been and where are we going, and putting them together in an applied fashion, through the practice of my art. And also I write a lot. So I've written for a lot of magazines, including like Canvas and Harper's Bazaar and things like that. So it's sort of like, and I curate. So in other words, doing these things, doing my writing, curation, and also my practice as an artist, trying to see where humanity is going, in this really, really, now hyper-changing world that we're in. And I think we're in an era in which I think these conversations are really needed.
I've tried time and again to pile stone upon stone, unbalance these scales. Now I'm trying again. I can finally see the reason it fails. If you're heavy, then you'll never set sail.
That was Patrick Lichty. His work is really interesting, and he was a fascinating person to speak to. So I'm grateful to him for making the time to speak to us on Technique. If you are interested in finding out more about his work, this is how you can find him.
Really where I'm most active in regards to my work at the moment is on my Instagram account at PATLICHTY, a redesign of my website is coming up at patricklichty.com in a couple weeks. And then also my archive is at voyd.com, which is a bit scattered. And I have a YouTube channel at Pat Lichty, and I'm pretty Googleable.
Thanks again to Patrick for being interviewed for this episode. Thank you also for listening, and if you've made it to this part, for sticking with the background noise. I'm sure you'll agree that it was well worth it. This was episode 48 of the podcast, and we are looking forward to some exciting changes when we get to episode 50, so keep an eye out for those. To make sure that you don't miss any episodes, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. You can also follow us on Twitter at Technique UK or on Instagram on Technique Podcast. We will, of course, be back again next month with another episode. In the meantime, take very good care of yourself. Goodbye.